This is a Hope 1032 podcast.
Hello, welcome to the Undistracted podcast, back for a brand new year. Getting underway as we continue to learn from our guests how to be better at building our lives with intention around our passions and our purpose. I'm your host, Laura Bennett. It is great to be with you. You can subscribe to this podcast wherever you're listening and also find video versions of these interviews on the Hope 1032 YouTube channel. Spending time in front of a screen is an accepted part of modern life. Whether for work or entertainment, screens facilitate how we connect, communicate and learn. Are they robbing something from us though? Not just because of the sore eyes and the strained necks, but because of the incidental time we give them and the attention they absorb. David Talbot is the founder of Glowface, an organisation that helps improve our relationship to technology and reflect on our allegiance to digital progress. His book, Glowface, is a guide to reclaiming your purpose and restoring humanity in the digital era. Let's welcome David.
Thanks, Laura. I really appreciate you having me here.
This term Glowface, that might be new to some of us. Explain to us what it means. Where did you come across this idea of being a glowface?
Yeah, it actually has a bit of a story to it. So I was at a party a few years ago, and it was sort of one of those parties where you kind of don't know everyone. You're kind of trying to make some small talk here and there. And actually happened to be a fire outside, a few people sitting around the fire, sort of listening to a few different conversations. And I overheard someone talk to someone else and saying, "Oh, you're being a bit of a glow face there." And I turned and I saw that individual had pulled out their phone and started sort of, as we do in a party, maybe we'll get a bit bored, we kind of pull out our phone, start scrolling through socials or replying to a text message. And it was kind of a interesting location to hear that concept of glow face as well, because it's very, when you're outside in the dark, the sort of the light of your screen certainly illuminates your face a lot more than in other situations. And I kind of queried the term to the person who said it. I said, well, tell me a little bit more about that. And they use it a lot when they go camping. Again, you go camping, you're out in the middle of the bush somewhere, and someone, you're enjoying the peace and quiet of nature, but inevitably someone pulls their phone out. And it was quite an interesting term that I think described the habit well, because it's sort of a reflection of, I think, what we tend to do. We tend to glow face on a regular basis, a lot of us. And for me as well, I think the context, when you think about it with respect to fire as well, I thought that was interesting too. Think about fire as as a tool. When we're in control of fire, it's really useful. We can cook, and it gives us warmth, and it's really powerful. But when it's out of control, it can devastate us. It can, rips through, hear about bushfires all the time. I think the same thing with our screens. When we're in control of our screens, they're add a lot to our lives. In control of our phones, they're a wonderful convenience and thing to have in our world. But when they're out of control, they can really damage us. And so sort of this combination of those two things, one being the context, the imagery of the glow, and then also, the analogy with fire, for me, kind of inspired this term glow face.
And as we're talking about the idea of being a glow face and some of the impact of screens on our lives, it's important for people to know, I think, this isn't something that's about guilting people into trying to put down their phone and detach from technology, because we hear that message so much. But in the way that you're writing about our relationship to technology, it came across to me as much more being about what is the effect of our engagement with screens on how our lives are lived in terms of purpose, in terms of what we end up doing with our careers, with our relationships. It's like there's something to be said for how our relationship to a screen literally affects the outcome of our lives.
Absolutely. I feel like we've kind of last 20 years, so much has happened in this space of screens and technology. The internet kind of blew up, and we've got iPhones, iPods thrown at us, iPhones, iPads, and now we're sort of super connected, right? We're on the Zoom call, that's conversation right now, but so quickly, so much has happened. And we've just kind of, I think as a society, we've just embraced everything, and understandably so. There's so much good to it, like you said, Laura, but I think there comes a time in the conversation, and I guess that's kind of where I sort of want to play a role, is coming into the conversation to say, hey, let's just pause, let's take stock, and let's just have a few conversations around, well, is this really adding as much value as I think to the different areas of my life? Is it
Mm.
really improving my relationships with my friends and family? Is it really helping me at work? Is it really helping me live a more fulfilled life overall? And I think if we can, have more of those conversations around the different areas where perhaps we've probably bought too much into like the sort of church of technology, if you will, like I guess challenge it. To resist innovation is not to reject it; it's just to question it.
In some respects, it may be a conversation, this one about how we engage with technology, the pros and cons of it, that may be a little bit of a tearjerker for some. Because I know for me, looking through your book, one of the things that caught my attention was this story you tell of yourself as being this young guy with natural talents and abilities, an inclination toward mathematics. And then it almost felt like there was a bit of a grief when you realized how much time you'd spent on screens, gaming, all of these different things, and
Yeah.
went, hang on a minute. I could have had a life and career that is very different to the one I have now as a project manager, which isn't a bad thing necessarily, but it
Sure.
was almost
Yeah,
like there was
yeah.
a grief in you realizing the gap between what you could have become and what you are now.
Absolutely. And I think it was this realization that truly I'm not the only one. I mean, like you said, Laura, I spent the majority of my teenage life, like I think a lot of kids who were born in the 90s did, kind of embracing all of technology and all the computer games, particularly Xbox, PlayStation, Nintendo, any computer game that I could consume, TV as well. These are all things that we kind of just passively engaged in. And yeah, I went through this process in my 20s where I found myself in a corporate job that was very unfulfilling, admittedly, and wondering what happened, and started reflecting back on what were my sort of natural talents. And I did have this sort of inclination for this weird inclination for maths in kindergarten, and could do my multiplication tables, and wasn't any savant by any standard, but it certainly felt like that was where my natural talent sat. And trying to wonder, well, what happened? Where did it go? And kind of realized that I'd spent a lot of time staring at screens playing computer games throughout my teenage life. And there's this theory that sort of gets floated around a little bit called the 10,000 hour theory. And it sort of goes that if to become an expert at anything, a musician, a chef, a painter, whatever it is, a mathematician, you need to spend 10,000 hours working on that craft. And I kind of realized that instead of spending 10,000 hours working on my talent, I'd spent 10,000 hours staring at a screen playing video games.
Mm.
And, realizing that I was one of the first generations to really get so engrossed in screens and computer games and a digital world. And then thinking about, well, that my generation, but also the one that's coming up now. I've got young kids, and you can see teenagers a lot these days engage with their devices, and thinking about, well, what kind of lost talents, what kind of talents will be lost through the constant use of these devices and screens, and hopefully recapturing some of the value of those talents through these conversations.
Mm. But then the counter argument to that could be that new talents and new skills are discovered through technology. Like, you think of the people that make entire careers out of stumbling into gaming and all of these things
Yeah.
that suddenly inspires these things. What do you say to that sort of side of the argument where technology, where our devices can kind of open up new lives and new worlds to us?
I think there's two things. One is it's sort of the needle in the haystack. I think a lot of people, you can see influencers and people, like you said, who make lives on Twitch or as YouTubers. It's easy to find them, but you don't realize how many people are trying to kind of be like that. It's the same idea as sports stars or CEOs of businesses. It's very hard to reach those accolades and those levels of achievement. And I think social media is really good at showing us the needles in the haystack. We don't see the common person, so to speak. We
Mm.
see the outliers. We see those people who have become most successful. I do think, though, I mean, to your point, Laura, there's a lot of creativity, there's a lot of good, a lot of learning, a lot of knowledge that comes from sharing content, creating content. And so again, I mean, back to your previous point, this isn't like get off your phone, don't ever use it, don't ever engage with it. There's value to be had there, but the value needs to come when I like this idea between information and knowledge. I think we've got a
Mm.
lot of information online, a lot of creativity comes, people kind of provide, high level, 30-second, 3-minute videos that kind of give us information, but we don't really get the chance to digest it and make it knowledge. And so
Mm.
my sort of counter would be, I think the real value in new ideas in creative thinking comes not when we think in a shallow way about ideas in 3-minute sound bites, but more in taking things and turning it into knowledge. So I guess there's sort of 3 points there. Really, these are the needles in the haystack. yes, there's some good, but I think the real good comes from when we take that information and can turn it into knowledge. And I don't think our screens are designed to really do that. They're designed to shift our attention and fracture our attention, interrupt us, and kind of keep us thinking at a shallow level rather than a deep level.
And from the moment I hear you talking about knowledge, I think straight back to that scripture where it talks about that, like, knowledge is the beginning of wisdom. And so it's like we don't get to a point of being wise, which feels like a more deliberate, sitting around a thought, discussing it sort of picture to me. Like you don't get to wisdom without kind of chewing on a bit of knowledge for a while.
I think that the whole idea around things taking time, we see things happen so quickly in the world of social media, things blow up overnight or within a few weeks. But reality is that for most of human history, to reach a level of influence took a lot of effort. To study for a long period of time. I even think about Jesus, for example. Like he took him 30 years to actually become of any notoriety, right? He spent his 20s. He's a carpenter, in a hot, dry environment, right? It takes time to gain knowledge, and I think we kind of lose sight of that often. We lose sight of how long it takes to really gain wisdom in this world.
It was like 30 years to get to the 3 years in his case.
Exactly.
And people, the thing we talk about, even for people who are Christians, you talk so much about the 3 years, you don't actually consider a lot to do with that 30. So a really good picture to kind of bring up. And I want to bring up a quote that is at the beginning of the book. It says, "It takes many hours to make what you want to make. The hours don't suddenly appear. You have to steal them from comfort." A guy, Derek Sivers, however you say, he pointed that out. That's a sharp quote. Like, that just pinches when you think, oh my goodness, is it my interest in comfort over a bit of discipline that really is affecting, what my life looks like and where I go?
I mean, that quote for me was kind of the basis for the book, really, is in order to be able to write the book or come up with the ideas around Glowface. It was always uncomfortable. It was always the late nights after work or the early mornings before work, and the hours don't suddenly appear, right? You have to. We all have ideas, we all have things that we think are, we want to pursue something, or we want to read a book. It's the beginning of 2024 now. We've likely set ourselves some targets for the year in terms of New Year's resolutions, and the hours to do the things we want to do differently this year just aren't going to appear. We're going to have the same responsibilities, the same stresses, the same things that happen, and unless we make a decision to embrace the uncomfortable hours where things are a bit different, then nothing's going to change. And I think it's difficult because we live in a world where it's so much convenience, right? Everything is built around comfort. I actually just finished a book called The Comfort Crisis by a guy called Michael Easton. He talks a lot about this in a lot of different ways, and how we are, temperature controlled. We can order anything on our phones that we want. All our information is right at our fingertips, right? But it comes back to, what have we lost because of that? Like, there's actually a lot of value in discomfort. We grow, again, think about biblical principles, the refiner's fire, right? We grow from these periods of discomfort. And I think when we kind of put down our phones sometimes and we walk away from the screen and we kind of embrace discomfort, we get to know ourselves a bit better, but then I think we also become more refined through that process. And
maybe that's the thing, people have an issue with getting to know ourselves better, because that's a really uncomfortable thing to do in an age where, like, there's a lot of things, that are affecting people right now. I still think on the other side of the pandemic, like there's a lag of emotional kind of trauma, for want of a better word, perhaps, that's still really affecting people. So there's a really big appeal in not getting to know ourselves, in not being quiet.
For sure. And it's so easy to avoid the hard questions. I find myself doing it. If you get stuck with a problem at work, or there's a conversation you don't want to have, you pick your phone up. Oh, let me just check socials. Let me send a message. Let me just check the weather. You all of a sudden become a weather expert for the next 3 days whilst you avoid the difficult thing, right? But it's lacking. Totally agree, Laura. I think it's lacking because I don't think we have the space to do it. We don't give ourselves the chance to be alone with our thoughts. I think we went through COVID, like you said, and everyone kind of got freaked out by this term isolation, and understandably so. I'm sure it absolutely wasn't the world we wanted to have, and I'm so glad that everyone's glad we're out of it. But it kind of left a bad taste in our mouth around this idea of being alone. But for me, it's actually a great quote by a early 20th century philosopher, theologian, Paul Tillich. And he says that loneliness expresses the sadness of being alone, but solitude expresses the glory of being alone. And I think, when we embrace some solitude in our lives and actually give ourselves the chance to ask ourselves the hard question, we can process some of the trauma that you're talking about. That, I think very much a part of society for the last few years. I mean, I think about Jesus again, like his teachings. One of the most, for me, overlooked aspects of what he did is he would often go away and pray. You kind of see it kind of in little sentences at the end of long sections, like Matthew 14, for example. John the Baptist, he just died. Jesus goes and ways and prays. He takes some time to himself to process the grief, to deal with the trauma. He goes and prays and has time by himself to think through it. And then he comes back to the crowd, feeds the 5,000, does the whole 5,000, the huge miracle, right? Again, and after that, goes away and prays, goes away and spends some time by himself. And then again, the third thing happens in that one chapter is he walks on water. And so you kind of have this really amazing chapter with all this content, and like kind of squeeze in between are these periods of solitude that Jesus goes and he prays. And I think prayer, I like the idea that prayer doesn't change God, prayer changes you. And so when we kind of take some time to go away and pray and be alone and have our quiet time, that we get the chance to be inwardly focused, have some introspection, and to your point, to process a lot of the things in our world that we just don't give ourselves the chance to process.
It really comes back to having a discipline and making a choice to put some of that space in our lives. Going back to what we said earlier about the hours adding up. We've got to take those hours, half hours or whatever it might be, to get that quiet time, to get that opportunity to focus. And there's a section in your book where you talk about a loss of leadership. So the way the book is structured, for everybody listening on at home, it kind of looks through some of the different things that can be affected by our relationship to technology, whether that's a loss of talent, a loss of depth, this loss of leadership, and so on. Around that concept of leadership, there's an interesting point raised about what happens if we follow leaders who are distracted, if we're following leaders who aren't willing to be alone, that quality of solitude and taking that time. What is the impact, do you think, of following somebody who is a distracted leader, be that in our workplace, be that from a more political perspective? If we're following people who can't effectively sit in solitude, what does that mean for us?
Yeah, lots of things. I think it's a great question, Laura. I think when it comes to leadership, I think what you get from a leader that practices solitude is one is the willingness to take some responsibility. I think we see leadership that when things go wrong and there's a mistake, or, particularly in politics, and it's just a broad stroke, not any kind of sides here or there, but people often kind of palm off responsibility or blame the other side, right? So I think firstly, if we look inwardly, we can take some responsibility for ourselves as people, but also if leaders can do the same, then I think you get a leadership that is more honest and open about their shortcomings as people, and that becomes more relatable, and it becomes less of a facade, so to speak. So I think you get more authentic leadership from leaders that can experience solitude. I think as well, you get more creative ideas. I think when you are in solitude, you get the chance to process your thoughts, not only from what do I think about traumas or bad things in my world, but also you come up with new ideas. You get to be creative in new ways. You get to have original thoughts. You're sort of not the sheep all heading towards the same cliff, right? You're just following that one sheep and everyone's the same. That individual can stand out a little bit more and come up with some new ideas, new solutions. And so I think we are distracted people. We are a people that is constantly interrupted throughout our days, and I think our leaders are a reflection of who we are. So a distracted population often votes in distracted leadership. But you think about some of the old leaders, people of old who would spend time by themselves. In the book, I talk a little bit about Abraham Lincoln, and he would make a deliberate activity to go to a quiet place by himself called the soldier's home. And he would go and think and spend time alone in his thoughts to process these really difficult things. I mean, he led America through the Civil War. He led America through the emancipation of slavery. These really pivotal things in a short period of time. And we kind of look back at these leaders who did these amazing, amazing things. We go, oh, wow, like they must have been different people. But you put these same characters in today, and these kind of same people who practice solitude, practice getting away with their thoughts. And I guarantee they're going to produce amazing results as well. And so I think it's that sort of difference now where you have a lot of leadership who are constantly accessible, constantly tweeting online or always available for people, versus the leaders of old that would get away, think, and spend time by themselves. What we lose is leaders that are willing to take responsibility. We'll also lose some creative thinking in the process.
Are we just being idealistic, though, thinking that we'll get to a time where people's relationship to technology isn't one of distraction, isn't one of constant activity. Like, can we get to this utopia where people have a really grounded sense of technology's role in their lives and it isn't negatively impacting the way we spend our time, the things that we do?
That is it's a question that bothers me a lot, Laura, admittedly. Like you sort of feel like it's this sort of plight against these big tech firms that are constantly trying to grab our attention. I think about other parts of our, you think about the last 100 years, and a lot of us watched the Oppenheimer movie last year, right? And they kind of had this new incredible technology of nuclear weapons introduced into our world, and everyone freaked out, and understandably so, right? But the long and short of it is the world kind of worked together. We set up a set of rules and a nuclear accord and the UN, and we have these governing principles in place for the betterment of humanity. And Laura, I think to your point, like how do we get to a better state with technology? Well, I do think there's a role in government, in policy, to kind of set more boundaries around how these companies can interact with us in a social way. For example, we know that a lot of the content we get shown online is just content that's going to drive engagement, right? And often we get content that is, quite confronting, or that maybe reinforces a view that we may have. But what if we set some rules and regulations around putting content out there that would drive more inclusion, I guess, more bringing two sides together, more bipartisan engagement, right? So if you rewarded companies for that rather than rewarded them for their ability to grab people's attention, if you set sort of policies around that, I think you start then to create a shift in how people engage with their phones, with technology, with social media platforms. That is for the better of society and kind of takes away some of the negatives. I mean, to your point, we're never going to get there, but I'm thinking unless we have conversations like this, and then also we can hopefully get some more policies in place at a government level to promote healthier digital well-being, I think that's the way forward. And it's going to be a constant struggle. I mean, technology is moving so quick. There's so many aspects to it. But I do think that there's not a utopia, Laura, but I definitely think there's some steps we can make in the right direction.
And there's a generation that we've talked about who, I mean, for you and I, we grew up in that generation where you're bridging, I would say, like you're bridging the gap between a really analog childhood and then a really digital one, and then an adulthood that's kind of just being consumed in that. But then you've got the next generation of absolute digital natives. Like they don't know a world where you didn't have a phone to switch on. And thinking back to that young David who's there with his natural talents and all of these things, and then suddenly years later goes, what the heck did I do with my time, And you're certainly not the only one feeling or thinking like that. For this next generation, and maybe for parents listening right now who are raising that next generation, what do you think like the practical steps are to make sure that adults aren't raised, that suddenly have that same realization of, my goodness, what have I become because my entire childhood was so framed by these devices?
Yeah, I think there's for me, there's a few practical things I think we can do. I think to actually take a step back, like philosophically, how do you change your mentality a bit? And I think if you can start to realize that attention is the world's most valuable commodity right now. We talk about gold and money and everything else, but all of a sudden, the last 20 years, we've built these attention-based economies, right? The top 3 or 4 companies, the trillion-dollar companies, have made themselves those because they can capture people's attention, or they produce devices that capture people's attention, like Apple, for example, right? And again, great companies, they do good, but also let's kind of balance the conversation. So I think firstly, it's a shift in mentality, right? So realize where you spend your attention is where you spend your time, and where you spend your time is how you spend your life. And so let's be more deliberate about that. I think in terms of practical things, one is I often encourage people to think about creating distance between themselves and their device. So, our phones, we're attached to the hip, they're in our pockets, in our handbags, always on us, right? So just a really basic thing, like leave your phone at home, leave your phone in the car, or if you're in the office, leave it in the locker, in your bag, out of sight, out of mind. Create some distance between yourself and the device. Same thing with kids. Create some distance between yourself and your kid's device. Don't leave the iPad out charging in clear plain sight. Don't leave the phones around for them to see. Hide it, make it a little bit obscure for them to see it. And that way it's not so front of mind. I think the second thing is use old tools. I use this concept called old tools ease overload. And things like using a notebook versus writing in your phone can be quite therapeutic as well. Keeping a journal. I even listen to CDs sometimes, like really old school things, but music is so beautiful, but we often just add it into our lives. We have, our phones and we've got Spotify on, and it's never really the center of attention. So I think, rethinking about old tools as well for kids, very simply, getting outside a little bit more, having more analog things like you're saying, Laura, in our kids' lives can add a lot of benefit. And I think finally being deliberate about how you use the device. There's nothing wrong, like we've said a lot through this conversation, nothing wrong with the device. It's more is who's in control. Are you in control, or is the device in control? Is the device in control of your kids' time, or is it your kids in control of how they use their time with their device? And so, set up that time. Give yourself an hour and a half a day. Scroll away. Have a great time. Like, comment, post, share reels, whatever it is, but have that limit. Set the limits when you look at it, when you don't look at the device. Set the limits with your kids when you allow them to use the device and not use the device, and then be strict with that. Be in control of it. And I think with kids as well, just the final thought is that you have to give them something else to do, which sounds sort of silly, right? But like, it's so practical. You can't just I do it all the time. My daughter, I said, get off the TV or turn the TV off. But like, what is she going to do instead? And so you have the next activity ready to go for the kid. Get off the TV and let's go and color. Get off the TV, let's go and jump on the trampoline. Let's go and do something. Don't just expect the time to fill itself, because it won't, because the kid will just end up back on the device.
And teaching them to be able to entertain themselves. Like, I know my parents did this, teaching us how to not need something else to feed our time. And it's a difficult thing to do, but we were given, a deck of cards, and it's like, here you go, work out things to do with that. Whether you're actually playing a game or building some kind of card tower, whatever, like you find ways where you are your own entertainment in a way, because you can't always have something feeding into it. But bigger picture as well, like one thing that you're trying to achieve with this kind of Glowface movement, if you want to call it that, what you're talking about in this book as well, is this restoration of humanity. Like, this isn't a quest to stop people using their devices, but about people reconnecting to the human qualities of who we are. Why is that so important to you?
Oh, that's a really good question. I think when you start to take stock of what's happened with technology in the last 20, 30 years, and for me, it's a conversation about how it's eroded different parts of humanity. And I think life is best lived when we live it as it's meant to be, which is sort of a bit implied, but in that sense, like what really drives value from a human experience standpoint, it's the friendships we have, it's our family, it's our relationships, it's our professions, it's how we spend our time and attention. And I think that's when we get the chance to really live life to the fullest. And I think for me, being more deliberate about our screen time allows us to, re-engage with the world as it should be. And I think there's this kind of sense that sometimes when we introduce technology into different parts of our lives, we're sort of upgrading and improving it, but we're not all the time. Actually, we're kind of removing some of the value from it. Life is, when we kind of get back in touch with who we are and who we're meant to be as human beings in relationship with each other, in relationship with God, across the board. I think that's when we discover value and we get back a sense of who we are and what we're here to do. And I think there's that part of it too. When we get back in touch with sort of core aspects of humanity, then we kind of rediscover, okay, what am I here to do? What am I here to bring? What's God put me on this earth to do? And it kind of, gets quite dramatic really quickly. But when you start to, I think about screen time as the most micro activity that adds up to the macro real quick. I mean, we've said it a few times. You spend 4 hours a day on your screen, and all of a sudden you've spent 10, 15 years of your life on your phone. By the time you're 80 years old, right? It adds up real quick. And you think about, well, what happens at that stage, and you look back, you go, well, did I get the chance to deliver what I was here to deliver? And hopefully through this sort of, Glowface, we can kind of have more discussions with people around, well, hey, taking a step back from your device, rediscovering the true value of humanity in the small and the finer details of life. That's where it's, life's best lived. And I think that's where you get the chance to reconnect with what God's put you on this earth to bring.
David, thank you so much for your time today and for writing Glowface, for prompting this kind of discussion. I think it's going to be really valuable to so many people. And again, thank you so much for taking the time to share more with us about it today too.
Laura, really appreciate it. I just will do a quick plug if you don't mind. Glowface.com.au is the website, And then I am ironically on socials. So I am the only guy though on socials who would tell you to get off socials. So at Glowface_DW Digital Wellbeing I'm on everything. So if you don't check out the book, just do check out the socials, because if you want to get some more ideas, I just share some practical tips and ideas about how to control your own screen time and that of your family as well. So, but again, Laura, really do appreciate this conversation. Thank you so much for your time.
Make sure you do find David on socials. You can find me on Instagram at laura.bennett_. You can also email the show if you like, undistracted@hope1032.com.au. Make sure you subscribe wherever you're listening. Let me know what you think. If you post a review, it helps others find it as well. And until next time, enjoy living this undistracted life.
This is a Hope 1032 production. Thanks for listening.